So we're moving out of the 17th century and into the 18th century. And these two periods are decisively different due primarily to one huge cultural movement that's called the Enlightenment. That's the Enlightenment. Um, the Enlightenment was built around a few key characteristics, a few key foundational ideas, and those things were um, well, for the first one was rationality over spirituality, which is something we really haven't seen before. All of a sudden, there's this interest in the sciences as a formal study. The scientific method is developed during the Enlightenment. In addition to that, you've got ideas like democracy, capitalism, freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and equality. They say that one, but they didn't really mean that one for a very long time. But those were the foundations it was built upon. Now, this particular cultural revolution started started in Europe, but it moved over to the American colonies and prompted the American Revolution, which then prompted the French Revolution. But is a huge shift in the way that people thought about how to structure society, how to structure government, the role of religion in a society. All of these things really were a direct response to the 17th century, to the Baroque, to the lavishness, the excess, the refusal to compromise on basically anything. But this is also, I like to point out, the first map that we've seen that includes something outside of this one particular area, and it happens to be North America. We're finally moving out. Don't get too excited because, well, a lot of the artwork that's being produced here at the time is fairly boring, and the most of the cultural influence that we see here at the time is still largely predicated by British, French, and Spanish culture. But the colonials do in quick order, make something a little bit different. Now, very quickly, um, this particular painting does embody a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment in that, well, first of all, we're fostering a sense of equality because, well, we have a female who was the primary figure within this painting. She is the focal point. In fact, if we happen to look at this guy, Thomas Mifflin here, the fact that he's staring at the side of her head means that his gaze redirects our gaze towards her, and she is directly engaging us with her eyes, which draws our attention. The fact that he's also holding this pamphlet, which is undoubtedly full of, you know, ideas about, let's say, capitalism, democracy, freedom of speech, or religious tolerance, maybe even equality. But he's holding it open in a way that creates this arrow, which is also what's referred to as a directional force. It guides your attention right back here to her. So she's demonstrating that she's not only a consummate wife who's able to spin thread, but she's also smart enough to hold a conversation about whatever foundational ideas happen to be inside this pamphlet. So, girl power. Now, moving forward, a lot of this reflects the academic ideals of the day, specifically this one. This one is interesting in that it does show a scientific experiment where this is a glass vessel with a vacuum pump. And this particular guy turned on the vacuum pump and has evacuated all the air from this glass vessel. And the bird inside that vessel has passed out because of the lack of oxygen. He's about to open this valve, letting the air flow back in, and all of a sudden, the bird comes back to life. Now, all these people are on board with this whole idea of science and everything, but these two little girls, as far as they know, just watch this man kill a bird in front of them. So they're still a little bit apprehensive about the whole thing. Now, back here is a young boy pulling the curtains closed over a window, which reinforces this whole, like, you see the expression on this guy's face? It's almost like he's startled. Stuff like this probably would have been done more commonly in secrecy because everybody wasn't a fan of the Enlightenment, in the same way that everybody wasn't a fan of the American Revolution, even the American colonies. So there were still people who were like digging their heels into tradition and religious piety and all those ordeals, and they saw the Enlightenment as a contaminating influence on well them as a people. So the people who were afraid of the Enlightenment um, also probably were a little bit paranoid of witchcraft. So if you were to watch this exact experiment from outside of that window, then essentially what you just saw was this man kill a bird and then bring it back to life. So yeah, he could have gotten in trouble for something like that. But I like that this reflects a lot of the fervor for scientific endeavor of the day. Now, there are three primary movements that shape the 18th and 19th centuries, and I call them the three isms. And this is the first ism. It's called Romanticism. Romanticism is, here's a definition, Romanticism is an idealistic or heroic version of reality. And Jacques-Louis David was probably the best romantic painter of his day, and Napoleon knew that. Now, Napoleon was conquering general, a really impressive figure historically speaking. Um, and knowing Jacques-Louis David was the best, he decided to get him to paint a portrait, and he did. Now, Napoleon did cross the St. Bernard, which is a mountain range, in addition to being a dog, but he did it on a mule because mules are better at mountains than horses are. Jacques-Louis David did not care. He's like, all right, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to put you on a horse, and that horse is going to be bucking at the edge of a cliff. But you're not going to care. You're not going to care because you're going to be valiantly leading your troops into battle with the wind, heroically blowing your heroic cape bravely in the wind as you heroically charge first on your heroic horse. Everything about this is just idealized. It's like something that would have happened in reality, but an exaggerated or amplified or just really idealistic version of that thing happening. That's Romanticism. This is Neoclassicism. Neo meaning new and classical referring to the Greeks and the Romans. Now, here's your definition for Neoclassicism. It is paying homage to the moral or ethical superiority of the Greeks and the Romans. At the time, this was particularly popular in America, which is why if you go to Washington, D.C., you're going to notice that most of the original architecture is neoclassical. It looks just like Roman and Greek architecture because we were in a position to build an entire new nation. And with that nation, we could choose any cultural role model that we wanted, and we chose the Romans because, as far as we knew at the time, they were morally and ethically pure and upstanding and always did the right thing according to all the stories that we heard about them. It wasn't until a little bit later that archaeology told us a few things that we would rather not know about the Greeks and the Romans. But visually, in regards to painting, there are a few clues that you get that this is neoclassical, and the architecture and clothing are the two biggest ones. The clothing that they're wearing here, these robes and cloaks, were not something that would have been popular in the 18th century. That's not something that people would have worn. And the structure itself, a clear reference to classical architecture. You see those columns, like the massive scale that everything is built on. But you also know, because of this narrative, if we can pick that apart, that this is neoclassical because it's doing the dirty deed of paying homage to the Greeks and the Romans due to their moral and ethical superiority. Now, this is Cornelia pointing to her children as her treasures. The whole story here is this is Cornelia, and she's gone to visit her friend whose name I'm going to pretend is Veronica. And this is Veronica, and she's saying, hey, look at this nice necklace I assume that my husband got me. Isn't it really nice? And then Cornelia's like, oh, that's cute. These are my three children, and they're my treasures. The general notion of this materialism, this indulgence, being unnecessary, not just unnecessary, but immature, is echoed by the fact this little girl down here is also playing with jewelry. It's like, oh, that's cute, you're playing with jewelry. Well, I have a family. These are my responsibilities, and this is something that I value more than material goods. That is a direct response to the excess and opulence of the Baroque. This is a group of people who are trying to reorient their moral compass and make sure that people are grounded in things like family values rather than material goods. So, if America had to choose a role model and they had to manifest it the way that they did, this is a pretty noble attempt at doing exactly that. That's neoclassicism. Now, also neoclassicism, we won't get into that one too much. This is realism. Let's start with a slightly easier one to pick apart here. The Burial or Nuns, Gustave Courbet. This is a 10 foot by 21 and a half foot painting of a funeral scene. Gustave Courbet did not decide that people would go crazy over this massive painting of a funeral. He didn't think that somebody's going to pay a huge chunk of money to have this massive funeral painting in their house because people don't like just generally being depressed or at least making themselves forcibly depressed through visual imagery. What he's trying to do is give visual representation to a class of people that need representation. And that's what you see here is the poor, the lower, the working class people who are attending a funeral because guess what? Death was just a daily part of life for the lower classes. This is like they're sickly, malnourished, um, still have dangerous jobs. Um, this is realism, and here is the definition of realism. It is the gritty, unfiltered truth of reality and the heroism of everyday life. It's like everybody doesn't get to be the type of hero that valiantly rides horses into battle. Everybody doesn't get to be that guy. Some people's version of heroism is just waking up every day at sunrise and taking care of your responsibilities and tending to your family and making sure that the wheels get greased and everything progresses as it needs to because that's your responsibility. There's something valiant and heroic about that. Just making sure that your responsibilities are taken care of. And the fact that a lot of times those things are still attached to a dark or dreary existence, well, that's reality for a lot of people. Now, let's carry that realism back over to this first one that we were about to talk about. This is The Raft of the Medusa by Theodore Géricault, an even larger painting of an even more depressing scene. A 16-foot by 23.5-foot painting that is absolutely, it's jaw-dropping. This is by far my favorite painting in the Louvre. It's every figure that you see in the painting here is larger than life size, so it's not like walking up to a painting, it's like walking into a shipwreck scene. It really is a jaw-dropping experience. Anyway, Theodore Géricault is intending this painting to be almost a piece of activism as much as it is just a cultural contribution because it's doing two things. Like one, it's literally telling a true story about a shipwreck. There was a ship that was out at sea full of cargo. That ship was called the Medusa. It began to break apart in a storm and take on water. The officers see this happening and they wait for everybody to go to sleep at night. They get on the lifeboats and they row off to safety and leave everybody on that sinking boat. The rest of the crew wakes up in the morning. They're like, oh, Jesus, this ship is falling apart. So there's somewhere between 100 and 150 crew members. They're just trying to figure out what to do, and eventually the ship does break apart, and they're just floating around in the seas. The raft itself is a bunch of the wreckage of the original ship that's been lashed together, and they survived. I believe, don't hold me to this, but I believe it was 3 weeks they survived. Floating out in the middle of the ocean on this makeshift raft, and there were 15 survivors in the end. Now these survivors ended up lasting that long because of cannibalism. That's why they're holding on to these dead bodies. That's why this guy doesn't seem to be all that thrilled about this situation. Now, he's not thrilled, but some of these people are. That's because there is a whole realm of human experience happening here, starting with the death and dejection. And on this other side, if you look really closely on the horizon, right there's a little tiny speck. That speck is a boat on the horizon, and that's the boat that ends up rescuing these people. And what they do to save themselves is they lift up this one dark-skinned guy so that he can flag down this ship, which is what ends up getting the attention that they need to come and be rescued. Now, he's not just bringing attention to this specific incident in its actuality, he's actually using this as a social metaphor as well. Theodore Géricault made this massive painting because he's essentially using this uh, disregarded, neglected, group of people to represent the lower and working class members of society, and the officers who stole the lifeboats, who rowed off to safety, who neglected all of these people, who took advantage of their position of power. That's the aristocracy. That's the nobility. That's the clergy, and essentially the statement that he's making ultimately here is that you know we're all these people are lost and adrift at sea, and they're lifting this one guy up to save them in the same way that we're all morally and ethically just adrift at sea and lost until we find a way to create an equity amongst people of all classes and all races.